Wednesday's dinner and discussion, we continue with our journey through the story, and we looked at Hezekiah and how he had received some bad news that day. And now Hezekiah, he's the 13th of 20 kings of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And he's a bit of a wonder. He comes from his father who closed up the temple and started instituting all these shrines and high places. He was raised in an idolatrous life, and yet when he assumed the throne, he was a completely different character from his father. He was a godly character. He got rid of all the high places, and he started a reform that returned the people to the Lord. I wonder what happened in his life that he was able to see through the idolatrous conditions, why he was able to return to the Lord. His first reform was the consecration of the temple. It had been closed way too long. So he opened it up and he set about cleaning it up, and then making it holy, consecrating it, so that the Lord's anger might turn from God's children. This is what he says in 2 Chronicles. And once the temple was consecrated, sin sacrifices were made first on his behalf, and then on behalf of the people. And unfortunately, the sacrifice was so great that the priests and the scribes did not consecrate themselves enough. Only so many priests thought they were needed. So it ended up leaving the job of the sacrificing to Levites who weren't trained to do this. Because these Levites thought, this is something monumental. It isn't going to take just a few priests to do this. Let us make sure that we are fully prepared, fully consecrated, so that we can help in the offering, to the shame of the religious leaders of that day. And that's what happened. After in the first month of the new year, after this sacrifice happened, Hezekiah sent out invitations, not just around the tribe of Judah, but all the way as far as Dan, up in the northern part of the nation. The part that had already been exiled, removed. If there were any Jews left, here in the next month, the second month, we will begin on the 14th day, the Passover celebration. Come, join us. Let us unite once again. And people came from all around. And this time the priests and the scribes, they were prepared. Every one of them had consecrated themselves so that they might help in this holy Passover. Unfortunately, the priests and scribes failed to make sure that the people were consecrated. So Hezekiah intercedes on their behalf and goes to the Lord and says, Lord, please forgive them because of their ignorance and uncleanliness before your sight. We have failed. You know what the Lord did? He accepted the sacrifice and the worship of the unclean people because of Hezekiah's imploring. And once the Passover was completed, it is at this point, according to chapter 30 of 2 Chronicles, that the people themselves went out and destroyed all the high places and chopped down the Asherah poles and destroyed the altars to Baal. The people were once again worshiping God, having put away their idols, and then bad news comes. After the restoring of the temple, the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, comes up and demands a tribute, so that the gold that Hezekiah had once adorned the temple gates was now being stripped off to make a final tribute to Sennacherib. But the king of Assyria wasn't satisfied with the tributes that Hezekiah put together, even though it was Sennacherib's tribute. Sennacherib said, give me 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah met that demand, And yet it wasn't enough. Sennacherib brings up his army, and as they are setting up camp to lay siege to Jerusalem, his mouthpiece comes up to taunt, that's the word, to taunt the people of Israel, talking to them in a common tongue, not caring for diplomacy, but trying to create civil unrest. And here's the words that Hezekiah tells his men at this point, found in 2 Chronicles 32, verses 7 and 8. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, because the king of Assyria and the vast army with him, for there is a greater power with us than with him. With him is just arm and flesh, but with us is the Lord our God. He is to help us and fight our battles. And the people gained confidence from what King Hezekiah had told them. Of course, the Lord protected him and the people of Jerusalem, and the king was called away. But as he was leaving, he still sent a letter to King Hezekiah with a fact and a claim. The fact, to this point in history, no nation has ever withstood the military might of the kingdom of Assyria. Everyone falls. No God has been able to protect their nation. In fact, the gods often themselves end up being firewood. Israel will be no different. Judah will be no different. And the claim. I'm not going to do Arnold's voice from Terminator, but that's what the claim was. I will be back. You can count on it. We give Peter a hard time. He walked out on the water further than any of us have ever walked on water in the middle of summer, in the middle of a rainstorm. And yet we give him a hard time because he took his eyes off of Jesus. He lost focus. But was Hezekiah any different than Peter? Even though the Lord had done wondrous things before him, even though he returned once again to the Lord, who blessed them with another 15 years, he still lost focus. And that's okay. He takes that letter and he goes into the temple and he lays it before the altar and he prays over it. He prays over this bad news. In fact, this isn't the first bad news he's received, and unfortunately it would not be the last bad news. He would receive bad news 2 more times. The second time, whatever is ailing him, it makes me wonder if he might have been suffering from cellulitis. That's a nasty little disease that affects the flesh. But after suffering from that, I don't know what exactly it was, but he turned to God because the prophet said, Hezekiah, get your affairs in order. Time may be short for you. And Hezekiah turned to the wall and he prayed to the Lord, who then in turn listened and said, Hezekiah, I will grant you another 15 years. Now, even after this miraculous healing, I don't know if that was miraculous healing, Isaiah said, put a pressed cake of figs on his leg, or on his flesh. And then he recovered from that. But despite the good news, despite God talking to him through Isaiah, he forgot that he was blessed of God. He again lost focus. He received, during this time of healing, a sign that he wasn't hallucinating, the Lord giving him another 15 years. Look, the steps, the sun will climb back up the steps, 10 steps. That is how you know that I will do this for you. And this was a global event. People from Babylon came, curious. I don't know what about the rumor or how the rumor spread that the reversing of time or reversing of the sun was coming from Judah, from the temple? Did it manifest itself as earthquakes for the rest of the world? Because the world spins so fast and then has to all of a sudden stop and go the opposite direction? I don't know. Somehow Babylon figured out it came from Judah and they sent an envoy. And in his pride and arrogance, Hezekiah said, "Look at all that I have." He opened up the storehouse of the temple. He opened up the storehouse of his palace. "This is all the wealth I've acquired. Aren't I a good king?" And then the final bad news comes. But because the Lord wasn't willing to relent upon the promise of 15 years, Hezekiah concludes this: "At least the punishment won't happen while I'm alive to see it." That's kind of harsh. It's going to affect his son, but hey, I'm out of the picture now. I don't care. He's a relatable guy at one time or another. At some point in his story, can we not find some points of commonality with this man? So in a nutshell, Hezekiah was a man, a king, who though he struggled with pride, though he struggled with arrogance, though he even lost focus on the Lord, through him, the Lord has something to teach us. Has something to teach us about how we handle bad news when it comes. And bad news tends to come. 3 examples of bad news: dissolution of marital vows, a medical diagnosis prayed against. I'd like to sit down. You have cancer. Or perhaps the death of a loved one. It's bad news. And our neighbors also deal with receiving bad news. Bad news isn't just from the point of the believer. It isn't a judgment against the unbeliever. Yet knowing how to handle bad news when it comes allows us to live a life that glorifies God and acts as a witness to our neighbors, so that when they receive bad news in their lives, they might have an Isaiah to turn to. And perhaps as we act as Isaiah to our neighbors, we might be able to draw our unsaved neighbors closer to God. So our first response to bad news when it comes is to humble ourselves before the Lord. 2 Kings 19:1 says, "When Hezekiah heard this report, he tore his clothes and he covered himself with sackcloth and went into the Lord's temple." Verse 2 says that his advisors came and joined him, also dressed appropriately in sackcloth. When the letter stating that nations haven't stood before Assyria, that their gods were kindling, who was King Hezekiah to stand before the Lord in his royal finery? At this point in his life, he realizes that he was nothing better than the lowest of his peasants, the lowest of any one of the nation of Judah. And that's how he appeared before the Lord. Humbling ourselves can be in that attitude. It is an attitude of introspection, self-inspection, a personal inventory. It means that perhaps there is something that I've overlooked in my life and I need to get rid of it. And maybe even a sin that needs to be repented. You see, when we humble ourselves before the Lord, we become bare to him. Nothing can be hidden. Even in our pride, we think that maybe we can hide things from God. Yet look at Adam. When he took of the bite of the forbidden fruits, the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what did he do? He heard the Lord coming as is usual. covered himself and hid. Nothing can be hidden from God. God is able to see us to our very core. Having the right attitude allows us to open ourselves instead of deceive ourselves. We need to turn and humble ourselves before the Lord. Our second response is to trust God. Verse 14 and 15, again of 2 Kings 19. Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers, then went up into the Lord's temple and spread it out before the Lord. And then Hezekiah prayed before him. When he received the letter, the king laid it out before the Lord. And then he prayed over it. See, that's what we're supposed to do with that bad news. We're not just supposed to internalize it and dwell upon it and let it eat at us like a cancer. It is something that we are to do not just once, but until we receive an answer. Jesus told of a parable of a woman who was always going to this corrupt judge and kept asking for justice. Every day she would appear before his court. Every day he would turn her away. But eventually he got tired of her. So he gave her the justice she sought. Because she was earnest in what she wanted and what she needed. So our prayers are to be before the Lord. Not that the Lord is going to be worn down from our incessant, constant, faithful prayers. But as much as that corrupt judge gave in, how much more so does our loving Heavenly Father want to give us to our prayer? Another example of praying until an answer comes was David. You see, when he messed up with Bathsheba, his best friend's wife, they ended up having a little child. And Nathan told David that, look, because of the sin, the child will not live. And upon hearing that news, David dressed himself in sackcloth and ashes, and he went before the Lord every day. He stayed there until a messenger came and said, the child has died. Wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the answer that he received. And once he received that answer, he stopped praying. Regardless what the answer is, our prayers need to be sincere, steadfast, and faithful. Now the final lesson is to be Isaiah. This comes from 2 Kings 19, 20, verses 20, 21, 32, and 33. Then Isaiah, son of Amos, sent a message to Hezekiah. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I have heard your prayer to me about Sennacherib, king of Assyria. This is the word of the Lord This is the word the Lord has spoken against him. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or build an assault ramp against it. He will go back on the road he came, and he will not enter the city. This is the Lord's declaration. That is the good news that Hezekiah needed. He was praying over the situation, the sieging of Jerusalem, the letter, and his coming death. And from those prayers, Isaiah was able to speak comfort to him, speak a word of encouragement. The Assyrians will not prevail. You'll receive another 15 years, and you're not going to see the punishment for your arrogance. When we are praying over the situation, are we open to hearing from the Lord? Sometimes, most of the time, his answer comes through our steadfastness to the word. Sometimes he answers us through someone else. Not unheard of. This last week, the author of the book, Surprised by Motherhood, was on Focus on the Family. Her name is Lisa Jo Baker. And she grew up a missionary's kid. And as a missionary's kid in South Africa, the elders told her that the woman's role in the Christian spiritual life is to be at home in the kitchen and having babies. Let that sink in on our American culture and how much that rankles us. Rankles especially half this congregation this morning. That is what she grew up with. She wanted to be a lawyer. She wanted to see racial tensions die out living in South Africa in the 70s and 80s. And she said, I love Jesus, but I'm torn because I don't want to be a mom. I don't want to have children because of what these elders have told me. And so while she was in college, Lisa met a gentleman named Chuck. And while they were on their third date, going to church together, what a nice date that is, a complete stranger, a black man. And this is something to understand was a big thing because she's a white girl, a missionary's kid in South Africa in the time of apartheid. And a black man turns and says, excuse me, I have a word of the Lord for you. Are you open to hearing it? Well, talk about awkward. That's her word. Could this get any more awkward? Can the hole underneath this pew open up so I can jump down in it and hide? Are you two engaged? No, we've just started dating. Do you two plan to become engaged? Well, we had been talking about marriage, so yes. Do you two plan to have children together? And then she took over answering, saying no. Okay, now the word makes sense to me. Jesus wanted you to know that it doesn't matter if you have children or you become a lawyer to change the world. He still loves you and still sees you as one of his children. Talk about a burden relieving her shoulders, from her shoulders. Lift it up. And of course she writes, surprised by motherhood, because she never became that lawyer to change the world. She became a mom. And with her husband and the ministry that they do, they are changing a bit of the world in a way that matters to the kingdom. They still love Christ. But at a time in which bad news was being hammered upon her, the stranger was her Isaiah. Now that brings me to the close. In the face of bad news, we humble ourselves and we turn it over to God. But perhaps you're not facing bad news. And that's okay. But I bet you know someone who is facing bad news. Isaiah wanted to be a messenger for the Lord. You can read about his desire to being the Lord's messenger in the 6th chapter of his book, Isaiah. But my challenge to you is this. Be open as Isaiah was. If there is someone who is facing bad news in her life, be willing to share God's love and grace. But be prepared for this. Isaiah saw the revelation that motivated him in the 6th chapter. So we should also be in the Word now, so that we can develop the gift of discernment, so that we can develop the tools that we need to do all good works that God would lay before us. Jesus said that he wanted us to see that the fields were ripe to harvest. But to understand that the workers are few, and therefore we should pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers. That was a fanciful way of saying, I want you to be open to seeing the need and then meeting the need. Because if you can identify that need, then God is perhaps calling you to meet it. I pray that the Lord of the harvest does send out workers. You see, that to see see such an opportunity in my daily life to be an Isaiah to someone who needs a word of encouragement, that is my prayer this morning. It is my prayer every day.